I would like to welcome both of our presenters. Joining us today is Dr. Beth Fisher-Yoshida, the Academic Director of the MS in Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program and the Executive Co-Director of the Advanced Consortium on Cooperation, Conflict, and Complexity. And also joining us today is Dr. William Brendel, who serves as President and CEO of the Center for Ethical Organizations at the University of St. Thomas. Welcome to you both.
Hi, Christy. Thank you. Thanks for having us here. Okay, so we're going to begin now. And the title of today's talk is on transforming ethical dimensions of organizational culture. And ethics, I think, is a big deal, maybe should be a bigger deal than it is and should be paid attention to in different ways. So just taking a look at the agenda, I'm going to speak on conflict in the workplace and then the role that ethics might play in there, and then hand it over to my colleague, Bill Brendel, who'll speak on how ethics and compliance departments miss the mark. So they're doing something right, but then what are the opportunities they might be missing? And then the lens of transformative learning, which is Bill's unique take on ethics in organizations. And then 7 habits of moral disengagement. And the 3-pillar approach, combining principled leadership with organizational citizenship with meaningful work and seeing how that comes together. And then making the business case. So in getting started, looking at conflict in the workplace, we can see that there are numerous reasons why conflict may happen in the workplace. And each of you, if you sit here and just think for a minute, you can probably think of multiple ways in which you had either been engaged in conflict, maybe on rare occasions you've even started some conflict, but we're not going to go into all the different reasons. We're going to focus here where sometimes there's a lack of alignment between our personal values, our personal beliefs, our expectations, and then the behaviors of those around us. So we all come into the workplace with a certain framing of what it means to be at work, right? And then sometimes other people are not necessarily on that same wavelength as we are. So it's also increased when organizations allow these behaviors to persist. And I put allows in quotes because it doesn't mean that they're actively giving permission for these kinds of behaviors, but we can interpret the lack of interference or stopping these behaviors as a kind of implicit permission. And this really can exacerbate the situation. There are times I've worked as a consultant in organizations where many people feel there's a lack of accountability. Yes, there are policies and procedures that are put into place, but what happens when people don't follow those or when they actively violate them? Are they being held accountable? So if they're not being held accountable, then some people can understand that as being given permission to violate the norms and the practices and procedures that have been set. This causes dissonance. What happens when you're in a work situation and you're having a lot of uneasy feelings, sometimes greater than others, which can cause mental stress, can cause physical ailments, can cause a lack of productivity in the workplace, and many other effects directly and indirectly related to this lack of alignment. So what do we do when we're in these kinds of situations? Well, maybe we can ignore it and hope it goes away, close your eyes and pretend it's not there. Some of us do that on some occasions because maybe we think that as bad as it is, it might be easier and less painful than actually dealing with it. Or we may complain about it to everybody and anybody who will listen until then we become the problem because we've been complaining about it too much. We can defy it, then we become actively defiant, which may not be constructive unless we do it in a constructive way, although the word defy, for me, does not lend itself to constructive behaviors. Or we suffer silently and just hope it goes away, again, related to the ignoring it, but by suffering silently, what are we doing to ourselves? What are we doing to our own values? How are we compromising that? What is the mental and physical anguish that we might be going through in that process? Well, we can try to better understand it through alternative framing. So that means that we have a certain way of understanding our situations, and when we learn alternative ways of looking at it, alternative ways of framing it, this opens up other avenues of possibility of how we might understand it. And so now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Bill, who will take us through looking at ethical organizations.
All of these options, ignore, complain, defy, or suffer, really are rooted into our habits of mind, so that a lot of times we do this from a place of habit or implicitly. We don't even think about what we're doing. We just sort of do it automatically. And with the bombardment of everyday organizational life, we're taxed. And so we sort of run on autopilot. So what we're all about at the center is bringing this implicit world to the surface. But we're going to start with a fun activity. Let's say you were walking down the hallway of your workplace or home. Well, let's stick with work. And you see this little crumpled piece of paper on the floor. I want you to imagine all of the different ways that you could talk yourself out of picking it up. So if you could, I'd love to see your responses in the chat box. Again, what are all of the ways you could talk yourself out of it? Okay, we see some people typing here. It's a new game at work to kick it around the office. Nice. We have a bunch of people typing, so I'm assuming we're going to get a lot of ideas. Exactly. Somebody else can pick it up, right? I'm in a hurry over here. I didn't do it. Why should I pick it up if I didn't throw it down there? That's just unfair. Yes, a disability or an injury can make it more painful. Very good. Oh, you could wait, right? You could wait. You could stall. If I see this by the end of the day, I'm going to pick this up. Good. This is great. It may be dirty. Exactly. That's a common answer. There's germs on it, right? So we talk ourselves out of getting whatever it is, the bubonic plague, from picking up a piece of paper. Ah, is it an important piece of paper for somebody? It certainly could be, although it's sort of a not, looking like it's very important. Good. Let's just take a couple more. We're practicing for trash picking up volunteering this weekend. That's funny. All right. Maybe two more, because I see two people typing, Kathy and Megan. It has a hidden message. It has $100 in it. Wouldn't that be a really cool game? All right. I don't see anyone else typing, so we'll move on. So what you just heard were a bunch of different ways that we could talk ourselves out of throwing that piece of paper away. One of the things that I've heard, a couple of the different things I've heard are that you're in a hurry, right? You have no time. It's not my job. There's a lot of self-talk, and that self-talk happens in a heartbeat. It's something that occurs very quickly, and we do very little, thinking consciously about it. And we just move on with our day. So let's think about this. What could the organization do to make sure you pick it up? So type in your ideas. What are some ways that an organization could make sure that you do pick up that piece of trash? All right, got a lot of people typing here. Award people a cash incentive. Excellent. Free lunch. Rewards, rewards, rewards. Okay. Oh, collective punishment. All right. Name and shame those who don't. All right. Sounds a bit like Survivor. You're thrown off the island. High standard of cleanliness in workplace. Pride. That's nice. You're getting them in the heart. Good. Let's just take a couple more. Guidelines. Good. Pay people a living wage with significant benefits so everyone feels an ownership mentality within the organization. All right, I see one more person typing. Let's take this, Liliana. Oh, we have a couple here. We have rewards for the ones who picked it up and punishment for those who don't. More trash cans around the workplace so trash disposal easy. Well, let's move on right now. And I'm going to say this. the things that you've just mentioned are one of the problems, right? So rewards and punishments can make people do things in the near term, right? When I say make, influence. Certainly money, pride, getting your, picture on the wall are all ways to encourage people to do it. But what happens over time is the benefit that you get from that begins to go away. And this is something that falls into the category of operant conditioning psychology. So this is sort of the older route of encouragement that many ethics and compliance departments are taking. But also if you're into leadership development or conflict resolution, you can think about how these professions can also miss the mark. So what I'd like to hear you do now is let's look at that crumpled piece of paper. I promise we'll get off the paper soon. This is the last question. If you see that crumpled piece of paper, use it as a metaphor, okay? What are the crumpled pieces of paper in your workplace? The things that are violations or problems that people don't touch. Gossip. Good. Okay. Improper data entry. Fantastic. Who's going to correct those mistakes? Not my fault. I didn't enter it. Amen to gossip. Absolutely. Drawings while working or listening. So people just kind of what they call social loafing at work. Good. Fixing procedures, neglecting to provide tests to patients for screening. So there's what I'm seeing here is a lot of negligence, microaggressions, right? Let's take just a couple more. Kathy and Liliana. Cursing at people. You'd be surprised how often that happens. And late arrivals. Yeah, these are the little things, right? Now, there's a theory in social psychology called broken windows theory. And the theory goes like this. If you're in a neighborhood where there is a piece of paper on the floor, on the street, and nobody picks it up, then people are liable to do, kind of escalate ethical infractions. So one thing might be, somebody breaks a window and doesn't tell anyone about it, and the window stays broken. So when people see the window broken in that area, they feel, well, there's a piece of paper on the ground, there's a window that's broken. You know what? I see somebody's bag there. It may have some goods in it, but they're not coming to pick it up. I'm going to check out what's inside that bag, and so on and so forth, and it escalates. So there is a slippery slope when it comes to organizational ethics. And now we're going to talk about how collectively this takes place and what we need to do to correct it. So there's the conscious mind and the subconscious mind. A real quick overview of that. The conscious mind are things that you're aware of every day or can easily become aware of if you're asked to think about it. The subconscious mind is what's sort of operating in the back of your mind. These are habits of mind that you've developed over time, and they're so strong that you just sort of operate on top of them. So if you're an employee, you typically have a point of view, and it's conscious. This is something that you express out loud. But gossip is certainly a way that people express their points of view. So is cursing, to show their disdain with something. Then you have a frame of reference. So this is the, I feel like people should pick up paper around here because, right? And so there's a frame of reference, and that can come from a saying you learned when you were a kid. Cleanliness is godliness, right? So you've got a frame of reference. And beneath it all, there's a habit of mind, right? The habit of mind might be something that is so deep. For instance, if you've developed the habit of mind that you are a victim, then you will have what's called a confirmation bias, which is selecting and hearing the things that you want to hear that confirm that you're a victim. Even if it looked at differently, you might not see that at all. So that's a habit of mind. For the organization, there is compliance. That's the act of meeting standards. So that's what the organization says that an employee should do. Very informational. And if you've ever taken sexual harassment training and you've checked through the boxes and you took the test, it's information and it's stuff that you can sort of look at, guideposts, to determine whether you're doing the right or the wrong thing. Ethics are moral principles that should govern behavior. And some people have more ethical knowledge than others, and some are more developed in terms of the way that they see ethical dilemmas, and that's just fine. But the item that we're going to talk about today is the deepest pocket of thinking in an organization. Organizational culture is defined as the subconscious expectations that drive behavior. They actually drive behavior. That's what ethos is. It's the spirit that is beneath it all. There are 7 habits of moral disengagement that are shared and can become part of organizational culture. So let's take a look at one. A habit of mind amongst employees might be that employees are, not morally engaged. So we're going to come down to the deepest part of the iceberg. There is a scale used to measure this called the moral engagement scale. And here are 2 items on that scale. If you gave this to all of the employees in an organization, you might find that, 2 of the, things that sort of are shared, the self-talk that's shared, just like we did with the paper activity, actually get people out of doing the right thing. So stealing some money is not too serious compared with those who steal a lot of money. That's called advantageous comparison, right? It's a way of justifying stealing a little bit of money. The way I usually describe that is you might take some paper out of the copy machine for your kids to draw at home, but you're saying to yourself, well, it's not like I'm embezzling money, right? So this is called advantageous comparison. Employees are not at fault if their boss puts too much pressure on them to perform at work. Well, look, it's not my fault that I'm doing this and that incorrectly, or maybe I'm playing solitaire or surfing through Facebook, because I got all this pressure coming down from my boss. It's his or her fault. So there are numerous habits of moral disengagement. And if you look at them through the lens of ethos or organizational culture, you can actually measure these. So what I'd like to do is go through them so you have an idea of all of the different forms of self-talk that occur, and you may see some familiar forms that we did with the paper activity. Moral justification is basically rationalizing your way out of it. I don't need to do this because it's not, it doesn't seem appealing to me, and I'm in a rush, for instance. I got to get somewhere. I can't do it. So that's kind of a way of justifying, like, I got a book here. Euphemistic labeling is one way of doing it. And that's, you could, and I've actually seen this happen. You could say, I can't pick that up because we have, that's a job opportunity for the union that works here and cleans up the garbage. So now you're labeling it as an opportunity when you could easily bend down and pick up that piece of paper. We've gone over advantageous comparison and displacement of responsibility, but there's also a really important concept called diffusion of responsibility. And the idea there is that you look at that piece of paper or that ethical infraction and you say, surely somebody must have reported it by now, right? I don't need to report it. That's obviously a problem. And somebody must have reported it. So you're just kind of like shrugging it off because you feel confident that somebody else has brought that into the organization's awareness. The 6th one is distortion of consequences. And that is, if people, see me not picking up this piece of paper, they're going to understand. I'm in a rush, you're in a rush, no big deal, right? It's not going to be any consequences here. If I steal a little money, nobody's going to notice, right? What am I going to get, a slap on the hand? That's distortion of consequences. And the final one, attribution of blame, is just saying, look, you are, actually I saw this come up earlier. I'm not the one who threw the piece of paper on the floor, right? So why should I be picking it up? Now, I want to just open up really quickly, and I want to do, let's see here, I'm doing a time check through my chat with my other presenters before I open this up for discussion. So let's hold a second. We're doing fine. Okay, thanks, Beth. So I want to hear, how does this resonate with you? Is there one of these habits of moral disengagement that you've seen more than others in the workplace, the place that you work? Or are there any questions about these that I can elucidate? So go ahead and enter your thoughts into the chat and questions box. See Liliana, Kathy, great. Late arrivals. Okay, I'll repeat the question. The question is, well, there's two questions. Are there any questions that you have? That's the first question. And do any of these 7 habits of moral disengagement resonate with you? Have you seen it in your workplace? Okay, multiple attendees typing. That's good. Thank you. I should tell you all that if you're interested in this and this really appeals to you, this discussion, you should check out the work of Alfred Bandura, or I think it's Albert, I apologize, Bandura, who's a social psychologist very well known in the field, and developed these 7 habits out of the time when there were several different things going on in the world, including Nazi Germany, where people allowed atrocities to happen through these different lenses. So here we've got a comment from Liliana, and it says, is it wrong to tell your boss that you can do a certain job because it is time to log out? This is something that I've experienced in the workplace. Is it wrong to tell your boss that you can do a certain job because it is time to log out? I'm having a little difficulty understanding that question, Liliana. I can make some assumptions about what you mean. Oh, you're saying cannot do. I see your correction below. So is it wrong to tell your boss that you cannot do a certain job because it's time to log out? What do you think? I think this is a good question for the group. What types of self-talk could come up, right? I've done a full day. I've done my fair share, right? Is it ethically incorrect to log out? I think that a lot of this depends on the context. So if you're a nurse, right, and you've got that one last patient, certainly you might feel a moral obligation to check on the patient. So I would just say that context is very, very important here. Let me just take a look at, maybe we'll just take a couple more. Let's see. I've seen mostly distortion of consequences. That's interesting. And all of the different ways that that can appear, sometimes a little more insidious than others. You might even not recognize that it's taking place. Constantly, I choose to not deal with something because I assume another employee is working on it already. You're not alone, Olivia. And if you think about the enormous pressure put on employees, this is a very, very easy way out. In organizations, one of the mentalities that exists at the social level is called work-to-rule mentality. And work-to-rule mentality is the mentality that if it's not on my job description, I'm not going to do it. The problem with the work-to-rule mentality is that sometimes things are not on anyone's job description. And this often includes ethical dilemmas, but it also can include opportunities. So this is an area of research that I'm personally very interested in. All right, let's take one more. I believe that diffusion of responsibility is almost in every situation of our life, both in social and working circumstances as well. Ekaterina, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I think that is a fantastic point. You might even think that this occurs on a continuum. How responsible am I for something? Partly, fully, excellent. So we're going to move on here, and we're going to talk about a three-pillar approach to shoring up organizational culture in a way that directly addresses these ethical habits of mind. And they do it in a way that is both researched in the field of organizational psychology and also show that if you do concentrate on these areas, they also lend themselves to organizational success. And there are a lot of different factors that will help you make the business case for taking this approach. So the very first thing, and I know this is kind of small on your screens, is what we call at the center principled leadership. Now, the way we define it is helping leaders rise above their own ego or their self-interests to improve the welfare and prosperity of everyone, the common good. So that includes the organization, its formal stakeholders, and the broader community. Okay, that's principled leadership, and it's much easier said than done. And there happen to be a number of different competencies that help you, do that. But oftentimes what's required through the transformative learning model is a disorienting experience. Maybe it's that dissonance that Beth talked about earlier that really makes you think about your own ego. Have you checked it at the door? And how much are the things that you are saying serve you versus the other person? Or maybe they make you look special. So that's principled leadership. The next pillar is organizational citizenship. And this is essentially the antidote to work to rule culture. Organizational citizenship refers to improving the moral climate of an organization by inspiring employees to do the right thing, even when it's not formally recognized or rewarded. Think about a workplace like that, right, where you feel connected to your work in such a way that you don't even need to be recognized for standing in for somebody or going the extra mile with a client. Last but not least, we have meaningful work. And meaningful work refers to developing a clear line of sight between your authentic sense of purpose, your raison d'etre. Why am I here? Why am I on this planet? What is it all about? And these are deep questions. But connecting that purpose and care with the work that they do that supports the organization's mission. So this can be done from jobs, from top leadership, all the way down the food chain in terms of salary. So a great example of this is you go into, I see some people have healthcare experience in here. You go into a hospital like New York Presbyterian Hospital, and you ask the janitor what he does at the hospital. And the janitor's, in the meantime, he's, mopping the floor. And he tells you, I save lives. Every day I save lives. Well, there's a really powerful sense of purpose, but how does that connect with what he does? Well, the organization can help that janitor see that the number one killer of people that come into hospitals is the infections that they didn't enter the hospital with, but they caught while they were there. And so a clean this cleanliness is a methodology for routing out infections. They call them nosocomial infections. So you see it could be done just about anywhere. So here's the business case. Yeah, I really couldn't fit enough in here. I apologize that it's so small. But this has been researched empirically. So leaders who are able to rise above their own ego, look at all of the improvements to the organization: increased productivity and profit, increased market value and growth, sales revenue, firm longevity. You can read for yourself. There are a number of things that improve. An ego, I wouldn't say ego less, but a leader who checks their ego at the door can be very inspiring. And as a matter of fact, they may not even be a very good manager, But if they are ego aware, it's actually quite refreshing. So these are the things that are, a strong business case for principled leadership. And why is it important to make the business case? Because this approach really talks to the heart, right? It talks to being human, whereas most ethics and compliance training focuses on rewarding the good and punishing the bad. For organizational citizenship, you have a number of related and some overlap, as a matter of fact, improved performance, increased sales, and on and on. Meaningful work. Here's some percentages for people who like numbers. You have lower turnover, lower absenteeism, fewer safety incidents, and on and on. Well, the way I really want you to think about meaningful work and why it's so particularly important is that by the year 2025, millennials are going to comprise something like 85% of the workplace. So with that said, just think about what that means. If we are working on making work meaningful, which is the number one thing that millennials are interested in when compared to higher salaries, there are numerous studies done on what an MBA student, for instance, what type of a job they would take if they had a choice between a meaningful job and a job with more money. What happens is millennials take greater ownership, and I think I saw this earlier in the chat box. They take greater ownership of the work. So I want you to think about the fact that, millennials tend to, according to research, rent their organizations. They try it on. They say, you know what, I might not work here. And so frankly, I don't care if Jim is stealing paper from the copy machine, right? But if you feel deeply, deeply connected to your work, you will step up wherever you see ethical infractions, including potential infractions of your very own by becoming more aware of your own self-talk. So in conclusion, what I'd like to do is sort of wrap this all up, and I know that we will open up for more commitment, for more comments and questions. Let's just kind of wrap this up. If we truly want to have sustainable change, you cannot simply do rewards and punishments as usual, and you cannot simply work through informational learning channels and the education as usual. You need something disorienting that gets people really thinking about their habits of mind, and you need to provide a holding environment that supports and challenges the people in the organization to see new ways of interacting with these types of ethical dilemmas. There are 7 habits of mind, or self-talk, if you will, that are crucial when it comes to moral engagement at work. And the key is not just understanding what they are, but also practicing awareness of those habits. There are 3 pillars of organizational culture that are researched to impact the bottom line and also humanity at work. So through this lens, bringing humanity back to work can actually improve both human and strategic prosperity, which oftentimes are positioned as mutually exclusive. Can we have both an ethical and a successful company? The answer is yes. And a great deal of research that the center is conducting is showing this. So I see a bunch of comments that I want to just address really quickly. We have Kathy's coming in with a number of comments. Fantastic. Kathy works for a remarkable workplace right now. Top leadership models, respect and participation at all levels. One of the things at the center that we do is we like to celebrate organizations that are doing the right thing, that have cultures that encourage ethical behavior. So Kathy, I'd love to hear more about your organization. Excellent. And a number of different, you see Kathy is offering a number of different ways that leaders model egoless or selfless behavior. And also Kathy's confirming that millennials do not show a commitment to work. Yes. Okay. Excellent questions, excellent input. Thank you so much. You know, I think one of the greatest parts of doing this today, I've noticed with all of you, is your level of participation. So I want to thank you again, and then I'd like to hand it over to Beth. So Beth, would you like to take it from here?
Sure, I'm going to jump back in here, and I just want to say that I'm not a millennial, but I want to defend some millennials that do have commitment to work when they're there. So I think one interesting concept is to think about the framing of what does it mean to have commitment, right, in the workplace, and what does it mean what does work mean, right? What does leadership mean? What does team mean? What does organization mean? So all of those definitions might be challenged and shifting. And so if we look at millennial behavior from a lens of a non-millennial, and we have different expectations, then it may look like they are not doing something that maybe we think they should be doing, right? So I just wanted to be mindful of that. So, but Bill, you can also unmute your mic, and we can just have a discussion and then just look at some comments and questions that some of the participants may have. I just want to take it, so Jerome mentions that I find many in my workplace don't want change, and maybe you can add some more comments about that, Jerome. I know from my own experience, and Bill, please jump in, when people don't want change, or the behavior that we interpret as not wanting or resisting change really symbolizes a whole host of reasons why, right? So change is something that can be very painful for people because it's suspending prediction and control, and it's really entering into the unknown. In my work with some organizations and with some departments and sections inside of organizations, which I have to say some can be really toxic, and what I would define as toxic is when there's a lot of absenteeism, that people just need to stay home for their own mental health, they can't handle the workplace, et cetera, many of the characteristics that are the opposite of what a good ethical organization would do. Then you ask people like, well, what kind of change would you want to see? And a lot of times, even though it's painful mentally and physically to be in these kinds of difficult organizations, people understand how to operate within that context. And so that becomes more predictable and that becomes more known, even though it's not healthy. I almost equate it with like the black market. Things are not available, but I know how to get it and I can figure it out. So it's not above board, but the idea of change and the fear that goes with it sometimes is stronger than the desire to change. Any comments on that,
Yeah,
Bill?
and I would. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Dale, what you've just said aligns very well with my thinking on this subject. There are you could really unpack this again in terms of self-talk or habits of mind around why people don't want to change, because the way that you approach it is really diagnosing, like a doctor, what is it about that person and also the people who surround them that makes it very difficult for them to change. And there's a great book by an author named James O'Toole, and it's titled Leading Change. And there's a chapter in the book where he describes 33 different reasons why people are not fond of change. And so you could imagine with all of these flavors that it's very difficult to have one single, best practice approach to managing change. There are multiple approaches, and the key here is addressing habits of mind that exist at the subconscious level. Most people don't like change because they've experienced change in the past that was painful for them. And so if you can get them to think about that experience in the past through a different lens or adopt a divergent perspective, such as a perspective outside of millennials' perspectives like Beth brought up, it can be very helpful in addressing whatever that flavor of change aversion is for you.
I'm going to add that Olivia has a comment here that very much on board with the idea that creating meaningful work to millennials so that they feel valued is the key to seeing productivity and loyalty. So I think it takes a little bit of motivation in a workplace for somebody to lead the kind of conversation that says, this is what I find meaningful. What do other people find meaningful? Because We all have different reasons for showing up in the workplace, and even if it's just a job, where it's just something that we're doing because we need the financial means or other kinds of access it gives us, well, then we still have to pay attention for how do we make it as pleasant and meaningful as possible, all things considered.
Yeah, I want to be very professorly for a second here and say that, and also practical, the word narrative or story goes back to the word meinen. That was the original concept of narrative or story, and meinen is the root word of meaning. And so one of the things, one of the areas of study that I really enjoy is the way that leaders tell stories that connect the work that you're doing with the work of the organization as a whole, but a really good story. And learning how to tell good stories and understand other people's stories is a leadership competency. So I think that's a particularly helpful approach, just simply understanding narrative and how that works and what the story arc is. So just to give you a route, something to follow up on if you're interested.
Okay, Christina has a comment here. How would you approach isolation in the workplace, especially when management is aware and okay with it? I would just say two things I would say. One is that this is especially profound now when a lot of people are not necessarily physically in a workplace. There's a lot of hoteling and people working from home and telecommuting and other things like that. So that does tend in some ways to increase isolation. But then in the second question, I would also answer with a question, what are the behaviors, what are the actions or comments that you're witnessing that lead you to believe management is aware and okay with it? And that would help me unpack that question. Because for me, when I look at that, I think, okay, there are a couple of assumptions here unless that conversation has already been had.
Well, it's funny because I'm thinking about the aspect of what are you going to do to change management, tone at the top. And, I really am a firm believer in consulting to go right after a key performance indicator that the manager cares about. And sometimes this takes, explaining to them that this feeling of isolation actually leads to greater attrition, which costs organizations millions of dollars every year. And you could find that out by digging into data like exit interviews, employee engagement surveys, and a number of other different sources of non-intrusive data to really paint the picture of, look, if you could increase this feeling of belongingness, which is the antidote to isolation, you could actually decrease attrition and add X million dollars to your bottom line.
I see that there's a follow-up to that. Well, it was just simply said, you should just come in and do your job. Well, that would make me think, okay, now that I'm more fully understanding, if I was an employee, that I'm fully understanding the culture of this work environment, I would have to ask myself some questions, and this is where the dissonance might come in, is why am I here? Where else can I be? And depending on what the answers to those questions are, for myself, I continue to explore further. There's something in the world of negotiation called BATNA, which is best alternative to a negotiated agreement. And so if I were in that job situation, I would want to know what are my other options. Because if I felt stuck and that I had to be in that job, then I would have to just suck it up, right, and be in that environment that may not be conducive to my understanding of the kind of workplace I want to be in. But if I knew there was any inkling of hope or opportunity somewhere else, I would definitely explore that and grow that opportunity and grow that alternative so that I could be more in alignment with my own values and meaning making and meaning of work so that I could be in an environment that was more conducive to that.
I would just very quickly add that the key ingredient there is mindfulness, awareness of when that dissonance is eating at you. And a lot of people wait, including me, I mean, in my own story, a lot of people wait till it's too late. They have an ulcer, which is what happened to me early on in my career, or a heart attack. And so why wait until it's too late? I just did a study on a leader's level of mindfulness at work and their level of moral engagement. So I use those forms of self-talk. And here's what I found out. I found out that if a leader is only slightly more aware, they don't have to be, like Buddha or anything, they're just slightly more aware, then their levels of moral engagement go through the roof. And so awareness is really a key aspect of, zooming in on these forms of self-talk, okay? And also stopping yourself before you go too far down the road into a bad situation.
I'm glad you mentioned the mindfulness practices and principles because in the NEC, our Negotiation and Conflict Resolution Program here, one of the core principles is self-awareness and really developing self. We even have a course that's called Self as Instrument of Change. And the idea of mindfulness is really critical because we need to get in touch with what is really important to us. And a lot of us, we think we know, but sometimes we're really missing something. And we don't always know about it until it's violated. And then we get a reaction and we say, wow, I didn't realize that was so important to me until I saw that it was taken away. And so the mindfulness is constant. Who am I? What's important to me? And what is my impact on other people? And what do I want it to be? And are they in alignment? So the impact and intent alignment has to be there. I think we have time for one or two more comments here. I see Yvonne wrote, I think that there must be an alignment of my personal interest and the interest, culture, and ethics of the company I'm working for. If not, I move on. Sounds like open space, right? Like the law of 2 feet. Move on. Some of us have options to move on and some don't. So we have to think about if we do or don't. If we do, what does that mean? And if we don't, what does that mean?
Beth, I jump in and just tell you, there's a lot we can learn from cultures outside of the United States when it comes to that concept of really aligning your values with where you are. And for instance, there's a concept out of Japan called ikigai. And the idea with ikigai is that you are combining what you love with what the world needs with the work that you do. And they found out that in areas of the world that you see the most centenarians, that is the people who live 100 years or older, that this element is at play. People do what they love.
Iki means life. I used to live in Japan.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, I forgot what the guy means. They say you have to look at the kanji and figure out the meaning, which may or may not be helpful. All right. So is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Bill, from this really interesting and engaging conversation we've had here?
I think that the key word is engaging, and it's engagement. And I think that the level of engagement that I've seen here today in this webinar is fantastic. And I know that the program Beth leads is highly engaging. I was Beth's student at one point, many, many years ago. Beth, I think it's about 2001 we go back.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. We age ourselves.
We do.
It's a while, and I can't tell you how much of a gift Beth has been to me. I hope you don't mind if I say this, Beth. In terms of my own personal, in terms of my own personal development, not just my learning, but my personal growth. So I'd like to end by saying thank you, Beth. Thanks for inviting me, and thank you everyone for participating.